Hi，我是林登科。
And I'm responsible for question 1. Question 1. The COVID-19 pandemic has been constantly impacting the world economy since 2019. Many countries have been gradually adopting the strategy of living with the virus, but Chinese government still insists to adopt the zero-COVID strategy. Therefore, Shanghai has been under lockdown for months because of Omicron outbreak. Question number 1. How can the lockdown of megacity in China influence the aggregate demand in China? So before talking about question 1, I want to make a comparison between the cases in China and in Europe. So I found a paper on the internet. The paper's title is The Macroeconomic Effects of Lockdown Policies. The author uses many mathematical models to predict how the lockdown will affect the economy. To put it simply, they analyze the effects of raising public spending and extending UI benefits. UI stands for unemployment insurance, and found that those policies had little effect on output and unemployment dynamics, but were able to mitigate the welfare losses from lockdown policies by sustaining aggregate demand and fostering risk sharing among households. Optimized policies were found to be close enough to the actual policies chosen by most European governments. Now, let's talk about the question 1. We know aggregate demand is the GDP, and it equals to consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net export. And since lockdown will make the consumption and investment to fall, so the aggregate demand will shift to the left. Also, the unemployment rate will increase. Question number 2. Use appropriate model to analyze the impacts of the lockdown on China economy in the short run and in the long run. So look at the left-hand side. This is the diagram in the short run. Because the lockdown will shift the aggregate demand to the left, so in the short run, the price level will fall and the output will also fall. And on the right-hand side, in the long run, we know the long-run aggregate supply is a vertical line. And since the aggregate demand in the short run will shift to the left, it will cause its output to fall in the short run. But over time, the short run aggregate supply curve shifts to the right, and output returns to its natural rate. Number 3. In theory, what should policymakers in China do in response to the short-run economic fluctuation caused by the lockdown? For monetary policy, the policymaker can buy bonds to increase the money supply, lower the interest rate to stimulate the economy. For fiscal policy, the policymaker can reduce the tax, raise the UI benefits, or issuing stimulus voucher to stimulate the economy. Question number 4. In response to the short-run impact of COVID pandemic in 2021, Taiwanese government adopts several policies. Based on your research, what policies have been already implemented by Taiwanese authorities in response to COVID-19 pandemic? One of the policies is quantitative stimulus voucher, 振兴5倍券. By issuing stimulus voucher, It will increase consumption. Stores will offer more discount for customers who use this voucher to purchase products or services in compliance with the government's policy. Although issuing stimulus voucher will increase the budget deficit in the short run, it is necessary to do so. Many stores can nearly survive due to the pandemic, and the stimulus voucher gives them a chance to survive. This is the end of my video presentation, and thank Professor for the whole school year. I learned from you a lot, and thanks TA.
My name is Wang Jiayu, and I am in charge of the second question. First, what are these sanctions? EU completes a ban on about 19 of Russian oil imports. Second, they kick out Sberbank, Russia's largest bank, from the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication and imposes a ban on 3 Russian state broadcasters. Second, how will they affect inflation in the EU? Real GDP, unemployment, graphical and descriptive analysis are required. Because EU countries mostly rely on Russian oil imports, so these sanctions have a large impact on the economy. A large increase in the world price of oil is an example of supply shock. Supply shock is an event that directly affects firms' cost of production and thus the prices they charge. It shifts the economy's aggregate supply curve and as a result, the Phillips curve. In these cases, an oil price increase raises the cost of producing gasoline, heating oil, tires, and many other products. It reduces the quantity of goods and services supplied at any given price level. This reduction in supply is represented by the leftward shift in the aggregate supply curve from AS to AS2. Output falls from Q1 to Q2, and the price rises from P1 to P2. The economy experiences stagflation, which means falling output and rising prices. So I write that the inflation goes up because the price level goes up, and the real GDP goes down because quantity of output falls from Q1 to Q2. So if the quantity of output falls, the unemployment will go up. Third question, what fiscal and monetary policies will the EU have to consider to get Europe go through this crisis? We can use monetary policy, and FED can contract money supply. When the Fed contracts the money supply, it raises the interest rate and reduces the quantity of goods and services demanded for any given price level, shifting the aggregate demand curve to the left. So if we let the money supply contract the money supply, we will shift the money supply to the left, and interest rate goes up. And because the interest rate goes up, our aggregate demand curve shifts left, like the green line I draw. As for the fiscal policy refers to the government's choices regarding the overall level of government purchases and taxes. So if we increase tax or decrease in government purchases, we can let the aggregate demand curve shift left. As this green line too, we can let the price level go down, but the even higher unemployment. Fourth question, do you think if the EU government can use a single policy to simultaneously solve both inflation and employment problems? I think we cannot simultaneously solve this problem because according to the Phillips curve, It shows the combinations of inflation and unemployment that arise in the short run as shifts in the aggregate demand curve move the economy along the short run aggregate supply curve. So, if policymakers contract aggregate demand curve and move the economy down the short run aggregate supply curve, they can reduce inflation, but only at the cost of temporary lower output and higher unemployment. So we can see the third, we use fiscal and monetary policy to let the price level goes down, but even lower quantity of output and even higher employment. So we cannot tackle these problems simultaneously.
Hello everyone, my name is Tai Jing, and I'm in charge of question number 3. And now let's just get started. Here is the questions. Let me show you guys the keywords. The first one is tariff on imported products from China, and this is raised by USA. The second one is net capital outflow increases in China and decreases in USA. Those two are background. And the last one is President Trump's assumption. He believed that net export of USA will increase. And there is 3 questions under question number 3. So let's start with the first one. Please introduce the details of the trade war between USA and China. Okay, so let's start. The United States has always had a huge trade deficit with China. The goods exported from China to the United States are hundreds of billions of dollars more than the goods exported from the United States to China. And the deficit continues to expand every year. So some people will be unhappy about it, especially President Trump. Since US President Trump took office, he has been extremely dissatisfied with the huge trade deficit between China and the United States. The US accuses China of gaining a lot of benefits from Western economies since it joined the WTO in 2001. Also, the US government said that China infringes on US intellectual property and trade secrets. So what US did? US imposed additional 25% tariff on 34 billion worth of Chinese imports, and China fought back by imposing additional tariff of 25% on 34 billion worth of US exports to China, including soybeans, the largest US export to China. And then, since 2018 till now, there were several trade talks between the US and China. However, after they reached a consensus, then something happened. Then, Trump dissatisfied with the condition again, so they could never work together. And now it's Biden's government, right? Its government said that measures to impose tariffs on Chinese goods will not be lifted anytime soon, but trade talks with China will be held. On what the effect? There are negative effects on the US economies and also the Chinese economy. For the US, first, consumers face higher prices, and agricultural and manufacturing producers face financial distress. As for China, annual GDP growth slows to multi-decade low. Also, there is stock market turmoil, so people lost money because of it. And that moves to the second question. Here is the questions, and let me show you guys the keyword again. First is impacts of both tariff policy and capital flow, and then it's what it asks for: real interest rate, net capital outflow, real exchange rate, and net exports. Okay, so let's see the graph here. So the capital flow results in the line of NCO shifts to the left. So it becomes the pink one. And the tariff policy caused the demand curve in the market for foreign currency exchange market shifts to the right, because the demand curve in this market is equal to net export, and the US is more close to open economy, so the market for loanable funds, its demand curve is equal to investment plus NCO, and I just said that NCO decreases, right? So its demand curve decreases too, and it just shifts to the left, and it just results in the lower real interest rate. And lower interest rate result in the even lower NCO, and NCO decreases, so NCO equal to supply curve in the market for foreign currency exchange markets. That supply curve in the market for foreign currency exchange market shifts to the left, and that causes real exchange rate increases. Also, the net export decreases. You can see the pink points in the lowest graph. Okay, let's say the conclusion. The real interest rate decreases. The net capital outflow decreases. The net export decreases. And the real exchange rate increases. Okay, let's move to the last question. Based on your analysis, do you agree with the belief of President Trump? Okay, so according to our analysis, the net export will decreases, and Trump's assumption is that the net export will increase. So, of course, we disagree. And Trump believes that the trade war can benefit the U.S. economy because net export of USA will increases. However, it didn't increase it decreases, so it's not true. And that is, thank you.
南系大一的学车黄经验. Today I'm going to present the question 4. In the past decade, the quantitative easing policy was often used by the Fed in the United States. As a matter of fact, Japan and EU also engaged quantitative easing policies before. First, what's quantitative easing policy? The purpose of quantitative easing policy is to reduce the cost of borrowing among enterprises and the public and banks, also provide sufficient liquidity in the market, and stimulate the overall economy. And what's the difference between quantitative easing policy and conventional monetary policy? Under the quantitative easing policy, the interest rate is close to zero. Then there's no way to continue to cut interest rates. So if you want to further stimulate the flow of funds in the market, the quantitative easing policy will be launched. Second, please give one historical example to show how Fed uses the quantitative easing policy in response to a crisis or event in the United States. Let's take the example in 2008. After the 2008 financial tsunami, because the US federal interest rate is close to zero, it's no longer possible to improve economic problems with traditional monetary policy. The US Federal Council began to launch a QE policy, printing banknotes to buy long-term bonds, raising the price of long-term US bonds and lowering interest rates, so that the public can lower mortgage interest rates to support the housing market boom. Third, use appropriate model to explain how the quantitative easing policy can solve the problem caused by the crisis or event mentioned in second question. Graphical and descriptive analysis are required. As we can see, the monetary supply and the public saving will increase, so that the interest rate will decrease. And due to the decrease in interest rate, the investment will increase. In conclusion, the aggregated demand will increase.
My name is Ray, and my part is the number 5 questions. In 2010, several EU members such as PIGS, Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain experienced the government debt crisis. It is known as European sovereign debt crisis. Many international investors withdrew their capital from Eurozone. The crisis caused many economic problems in the Eurozone and the rest of the world. And the first question is, what is the European sovereign debt crisis and how did it happen? First, what is European debt crisis? The so-called European debt crisis is a sovereign debt crisis in some country in the Euro area, triggered by the US supreme mortgage crisis. Of course, the US financial crisis is only the triggers, and the essence of the problem lies in the excessive debt of the government of these countries. The US financial crisis punctured the economic bubbles in some countries in the Eurozone, and the government had to issue debt to borrow money to stimulate the economy and maintain spending. However, the result of excessive borrowing was that one day the debt suddenly became unsustainable. And how did it happen? Which cause of the European debt crisis? The fundamental and direct cause of the European debt crisis is the excessively high level of government debt, while the indirect cause of the crisis mainly include economic fragility, social welfare, financial crisis, and the falling down of rating agency. In terms of economy, the crisis countries are overly dependent on real estate and tourism, and the single entity of the economic structure is seriously hollowed out, making the economy weak against the financial crisis. High social welfare is a common problem in crisis countries, and the rigidity of the welfare system cannot adapt to economic change, which makes the burden of social welfare burdens on the government's back continue to expand. The US financial crisis is an important driving force behind the European debt crisis, making countries in debt crisis heavily in debt to save their own finance and economies. The downgrades of these countries by international rating agencies have made the situation even worse, making the borrowing costs of the crisis countries beyond the acceptable range, and they have to ask for international rescue to continue their lives. And the second question is use appropriate models to analyze the impact of the debt crisis on the following. macroeconomic variable of the Eurozone. Real interest, net capital outflow, real exchange, and net export. And this is my graph. You can see in the question say that many international investors withdrew their capital from Eurozone. So due to the increase of NCO, the demand for non-notable funds will shift to the right and cause the interest rate increase. And the increase of NCO will also decrease the real exchange rate. And if decrease the real exchange rate, will cause euro depreciate and will have favorable in export. The third question is, several EU countries, including Germany and major exporters in the world, as a matter of fact, they got a benefit from this crisis. And why is it? Germany and some countries are the major exporter in the world. And take Germany for example. Germany are major exporters in the world, and the euro depreciate will have a favorable export in economy. So Germany got the benefit from this crisis. And furthermore, the European debt problem makes investors choose more stable investment targets, like German government bonds. So German finance ministers can save money on lower bond rate.